On October 14, 2024, a park ranger named Elias Thorne was conducting a routine survey of a seasonal drainage pipe near the base of the Royal Arches in Yosemite National Park when he looked down and saw something that should not have been there. It was a bicycle helmet, high visibility yellow but dulled by a thick coating of granite dust and dried pine needles. Strapped to the top was a small action camera. The red tally light was not blinking, yet when Thorne brushed away the debris, the device felt unnaturally warm to the touch. This was 32 days after Julian Vane had been declared missing. Julian was not an amateur. He was a competitive endurance cyclist, a man whose life was measured in watts, cadence, and topographic precision. He knew these roads. He knew the risks. He carried 2 independent GPS units, a satellite messenger, and enough emergency gear to survive a week in the sub-alpine cold. His disappearance was not just a tragedy, it was a mechanical impossibility. To understand the void Julian left behind, we must look at the data. At 5:14 a.m. on September 12th, Julian's smart trainer logged his final indoor warm-up. At 6:03 a.m., his vehicle entered the Big Oak Flat entrance. The dashcam footage from the gate shows a man in peak physical condition, adjusting his gloves, checking the seal on his hydration bladder. He looks into the lens for a brief second. There is no fear. There is only the quiet confidence of a man who has mastered his environment. At 6:45 a.m., Julian unloads his custom carbon fiber road bike. The bike was a marvel of engineering, weighing less than 15 pounds, equipped with hydraulic disc brakes and electronic shifting. It was a machine built for control. He starts his computer. The satellites lock. The first data point is dropped. He begins to climb. The climb toward Glacier Point is a grueling test of stamina, but for Julian it was a recovery ride. His heart rate remains a steady, rhythmic 142 beats per minute. At 7:30 a.m., he passes a group of hikers near the trailhead. They remember him as a blur of neon and spinning legs. He was moving fast. Too fast, perhaps, for a man with nowhere to be. At 8:12 a.m., Julian reaches the first overlook. He stops for exactly 42 seconds to consume a high-calorie gel and check his heading. The metadata from his bike computer shows he was perfectly on course. At 8:55 a.m., the first anomaly occurs. Julian is traveling at 24 miles per hour on a flat stretch of asphalt when his heart rate suddenly spikes to 188. There is no change in elevation. There is no increase in power output. His pedaling stops. The GPS coordinates show him hovering on the edge of the road for 3 minutes. In the silence of the High Sierra, 3 minutes is an eternity. Why would an elite athlete stop in the middle of a record-pace run? The mountains provide no answers. At 8:58 a.m., he begins moving again, but the data is erratic. His cadence drops to a sluggish 40 revolutions per minute. He is no longer racing, he is struggling. At 9:15 a.m., Julian Vane reaches the Bridal Veil Fall turnoff. This is where the digital trail ends. His Garmin, his phone, and his satellite tracker all go dark at the exact same microsecond. Total signal loss, no pings, no SOS, just an abrupt surgical excision from the grid. For the next 30 days, the search and rescue teams would scour every inch of the drainage basins and the granite cliffs. They found nothing. No tire marks, no torn fabric, no blood. The expert had vanished, his preparedness rendered irrelevant by a silence that seemed to swallow sound itself. When Elias Thorne found the helmet a month later, it was nearly 3 miles from Julian's last known coordinate, in a location that no cyclist could reach on 2 wheels. The camera was still hot. It was not just recording, it was processing. Imagine you are standing on that service road looking at the device. You press the playback button. You expect to see a crash. You expect to see a fall. Instead, you see the mundane turned into the nightmare. The footage begins at 9:15 a.m., the exact moment the GPS died. The camera is steady. Julian is standing on the pavement, looking up at the sky. The sun is bright, washing out the horizon. He isn't moving. He isn't breathing heavily. He is just listening. The audio captures a low-frequency hum. a sound like a distant transformer or a swarm of bees vibrating in the granite. Julian reaches up and touches the camera. He whispers a single word, but the wind tears it away. Then he begins to walk. He doesn't ride. He leaves the $15,000 bike leaning against a tree and walks into the dense brush. The footage is rhythmic, the sway of the camera mimicking a funeral march, step after step. The brush gives way to a clearing that shouldn't exist according to the official park maps. It is a circle of scorched earth where nothing grows, not even the resilient mountain weeds. Julian enters the circle. At 10:04 a.m., the shadows on the ground begin to move independently of the sun. They stretch and contract, reaching toward Julian's feet like ink spilled on a canvas. He doesn't run. He doesn't scream. His hands are visible in the frame, steady and calm. He is an expert, after all. He is analyzing the impossible. He holds his hand out to the shadow, and the camera captures a moment of forensic impossibility. His fingers begin to transparentize, the bone structure visible beneath the skin like a medical X-ray. At 10:12 a.m., Julian speaks again, his voice clear this time, recorded directly into the camera's internal microphone. He says, "It isn't cold, it's empty." Those are his final words. The camera falls. The lens hits the dirt, framing a macro shot of a single pine needle. For the next 720 hours, the camera records the slow passage of time. It records the ants crawling over the casing. It records the rain that should have fried the circuits but instead seemed to beat off the plastic as if it were pressurized. It records the light of the moon, which on the night of the 20th appears to stay in the center of the frame for 6 hours without moving. This is the evidence of the void. Julian Vane, a man who lived by the logic of the physical world, was taken by something that ignores the laws of physics. His bike was found 3 days after the helmet, leaning against that same tree, untouched, the tires still holding 60 pounds of pressure. The chain was clean, the water bottles were full. The man was gone, but his tools remained, mocking the searchers with their utility. We look at the logs and we see a pattern of perfection interrupted by a glitch in reality. The investigator's grief comes not from the loss of life, but from the loss of explanation. If a man as prepared as Julian can be erased, what hope is there for the rest of us? The mountains don't explain why. They only keep the artifacts. The helmet cam, now sitting in an evidence locker in a climate-controlled room, continues to generate heat. Technical experts have imaged the flash drive a dozen times, but the metadata remains corrupted, showing a file creation date of October 14, 2026, 2 years in the future. GPS drift is common in the canyons, but this wasn't drift. This was a displacement. Julian Vane did not fall. He was not attacked by an animal. He did not succumb to the elements. He reached the limit of the map and decided to see what was on the other side. As we reconstruct the narrative truth, we find ourselves staring into the same clearing Julian did. We see the scorched earth and the moving shadows, and we feel the same hum in our marrow. The tragedy is not that he died, but that he found what he was looking for, and it was a place where we cannot follow. The investigator obsesses over the frame at 10:12 a.m., zooming in on the transparent fingers, looking for a trick of the light, a sensor error, anything to ground the event in the mundane. But the pixels do not lie. The density of the bone is consistent with Julian's medical records. The light refraction is mathematically correct. The expert victim met an expert end. We are left with the equipment, the carbon fiber frame, the high-visibility yellow helmet, and the camera that refused to stop. These are the markers of a life lived in the pursuit of the peak, now reduced to exhibits in a case that will never be closed. Why would he walk away? Why would he leave the bike? The questions are the only things that remain. The mountains keep their secrets, and the silence is the only testimony we are allowed to hear. Imagine you are Julian. You have reached the summit of your physical life. You have the best gear, the best training, the best data, and then you see a door where there should be a wall. Do you stay in the world of watts and cadence, or do you walk through? The evidence suggests that for Julian, the choice was already made before he even unclipped his pedals. The void was not an accident. It was a destination. The forensic analysis of the camera's internal clock revealed a secondary layer of data that the initial investigators had missed. A series of subsonic pulses recorded as white noise but structured with the mathematical precision of a broadcast. By October 18th, 4 days after the discovery of the helmet, a specialist in digital forensics named Sarah Jenkins began the process of deconstructing the audio. Sarah was a proxy for the collective obsession, a woman who lived in the frequencies of the unexplained. She did not look for ghosts, she looked for anomalies in the noise floor. What she found was a sequence of coordinates that did not correspond to any known terrestrial location. They were offsets, calculated from the center of the Earth's core, pointing toward a void in the crust beneath the Yosemite Valley. This was the beginning of the discovery phase, where the physical evidence began to contradict the physical world. At 11:45 p.m. on the night she isolated the signal, Sarah recorded a personal log. Her voice is weary, a sharp contrast to the clinical data she is describing. She notes that the camera's battery, a standard lithium-ion cell designed to last 2 hours, had somehow operated for 744 hours without a recharge. The laws of thermodynamics suggest that energy cannot be created from nothing, yet the camera remained at a constant internal temperature of 98.6 degrees, human body temperature. It was as if the device had become a biological extension of Julian himself. The physical evidence was migrating. On October 21st, a search team returning to the clearing where the helmet was found discovered that the scorched earth had expanded by exactly 1.6 centimeters in every direction. The expansion was perfectly circular. There were no tracks leading in or out, but in the center of the circle, where Julian had last been seen, a small object was now sitting on the dirt. It was a cycling computer, identical to the one found on Julian's bike, but the screen was not glass. It was a polished slab of obsidian. When the lead investigator, a man who had spent 20 years recovering bodies from the granite cracks of the Sierras, reached out to touch it, he reported a sensation of profound displacement. He described it as feeling like his hand was moving through water while his eyes saw it moving through air. The obsidian device was bagged and tagged as Exhibit B. The expert victim's tools were returning, but they were transformed. We must look at the inventory of Julian's backpack, recovered near the bike, to understand the irony of his preparedness. Inside the waterproof casing, investigators found a thermal emergency blanket, unused, a high-altitude medical kit, unopened, and a topographical map of the region with a hand-drawn circle around an area known as the Devil's Bathtub. The circle was not drawn in ink. It was etched into the paper with a precision that suggests a laser or a very steady, very sharp blade. Julian had known where he was going. He was not lost. He was navigating a route that wasn't on the official maps. At 1:30 p.m. on October 23rd, the forensic team at the lab in Sacramento attempted to power on the obsidian device. The moment the power source was connected, every digital clock in the facility reset to 9:15 a.m., the timestamp of Julian's disappearance. The lights did not flicker. They changed color, shifting into a spectrum that the human eye struggled to process, a hue between violet and nothingness. The reconstruction of the narrative truth began to move away from a missing person case and toward a forensic study of a rupture. Imagine you are Sarah Jenkins, sitting in that lab, watching the time on your phone crawl backward while the obsidian screen begins to display a live feed of the Royal Arches, but from an angle that would require a camera to be suspended 400 feet in the air with no support. The footage is crystal clear. It shows Julian. He is standing on a ledge that does not exist in our reality. He is looking at his hands. The skin is now completely transparent. You can see the blood flowing through his veins, but the blood is not red. It is a shimmering, iridescent silver. He looks directly into the camera, not the one on his helmet, but the one recording him from the empty air, and he smiles. It is not the smile of a man in distress. It is the smile of a scientist who has just proven a forbidden theory. The irony is staggering. Julian Vane spent his life optimizing his body for the physical constraints of this world, only to find a world where those constraints were the very thing holding him back. His preparedness was a cage. The grieving investigator in Sarah couldn't help but ask, did he find the door or did the door find him? At 3:19 a.m. on October 25th, the Obsidian device emitted a single high-pitched tone that shattered every window in the forensics lab. When the dust settled, the device was gone. In its place was a pile of fine white sand. Chemical analysis would later reveal the sand was composed of crushed human bone and ancient sea salt. The mountains were returning Julian piece by piece, but they were breaking him down into his most basic elements. The investigation was now a chronicle of decay and transmutation. The expert victim was being archived by the landscape. On October 27th, the weather in Yosemite turned. A freak snowstorm, unpredicted by any meteorological model, dumped 3 feet of powder on the valley floor in less than 4 hours. The search for Julian's remains was officially suspended, but the open loop remained. Why would the shadows move? Why would the battery never die? The mountains don't explain why. They only provide the stage for the impossible. We are forced to look at the metadata of our own lives, the GPS tracks we leave behind, and wonder if there are gaps in the map that we are walking over every day. Julian didn't fall into a hole in the ground. He fell into a hole in the logic of the universe. The third phase of the reconstruction began when the snow melted a week later. In the clearing, the scorched earth was gone. In its place was a lush, vibrant carpet of wildflowers that shouldn't bloom until July, and in the center of the flowers, sitting perfectly upright, was Julian's water bottle. It was still ice cold. When the liquid inside was tested, it wasn't water. It was a heavy isotope of hydrogen, something typically found in the cooling loops of nuclear reactors or the hearts of dying stars. The mundane item had become a vessel for the cosmic. The investigator holding the cold plastic bottle realized that the search was no longer about finding Julian. It was about documenting the transition of a human being into a memory of the future. The data points were no longer showing where he had been, but where the world was going. At 4:45 p.m. on November 1st, the Park Service received a final signal from Julian's satellite messenger. It didn't contain an SOS. It contained a single line of code, a sequence that, when executed, deleted every photo of Julian from the park's database. It was a digital suicide, a systematic erasing of the expert victim from the record. He didn't want to be remembered as a man who vanished. He wanted to be the silence that followed. Imagine you are the one who finds that message. You realize that Julian isn't waiting to be rescued. He is the one who closed the door behind him. The mountains keep their secrets because the secrets are more beautiful than the truth. The story of Julian Vane is a warning to those who think that preparedness is a shield. It is not. It is merely a more organized way to face the inevitable. As we move into the final reconstruction of his last moments, we must accept that the physical evidence is a language we are only beginning to translate. The helmet cam, the obsidian screen, the silver blood. These are the fragments of a narrative that defies the slow-burn rhythm of our ordinary lives. We are left watching the static-filled archival footage, looking for the flashbulb transition that will finally explain the void. But the screen only reflects our own faces, pale and searching, while the timestamps continue to march forward into a future Julian already occupies. He is the metadata of the wilderness now. He is the GPS drift that leads you off the trail and into the clearing. And as the sun sets over the Royal Arches, casting long, independent shadows over the granite, we are forced to ask, if you saw the door, would you have the courage to leave the bike behind? The transition from the discovery to the reconstruction marked a shift in the investigation from the physical to the metaphysical, a period where the grieving investigators ceased looking for a body and began looking for a meaning. By November 5th, the case file for Julian Vane had swelled to over 4,000 pages of technical contradictions. At 10:22 a.m. that morning, a team of specialized surveyors returned to the Bridal Veil Fall turnoff with a terrestrial LiDAR scanner, a device that uses pulsed laser light to map the environment with millimeter precision. They were searching for a topographical anomaly, a reason why a man would simply cease to exist on a flat plane. What the LiDAR revealed was a forensic impossibility. In the exact center of the road where Julian's heart rate had spiked to 188, The lasers recorded a geometric shadow. It was a perfect cube of non-space, roughly 3 meters wide, that the light could not penetrate. It wasn't an object, it was an absence. The data showed that the laser pulses were entering the space but never reflecting back. The mountains were no longer just keeping secrets, they were actively deleting information. At 11:40 a.m., the lead surveyor, a man who had mapped the most treacherous terrain on Earth, stood at the edge of this non-space and felt a wave of nausea so profound he had to be physically restrained from collapsing. He described a sensation of narrative weight, as if the air itself was heavy with a story that hadn't been written yet. The expert victim's journey was being reconstructed not through what was found, but through what was missing. Imagine you are standing on that asphalt, looking at a patch of air that feels like a bruise on the world. This is the void Julian encountered. The timestamp pacing of the evidence suggests that at 12:02 p.m., the geometric shadow began to resonate. A nearby seismic sensor designed to detect rockfalls recorded a rhythmic vibration that matched the cadence of a human heart, 142 beats per minute. Julian's resting race pace. The environment was echoing the man it had consumed. At 1:15 p.m., the investigation took a darker turn when a recovery drone flying over the unreachable ledges of the arches captured a series of macro shots of the granite wall. Etched into the stone in letters 4 feet high was a string of binary code. When translated, it read, "The weight is the lie." This was the indirect dialogue of the mountain, a quote pulled from the very fabric of the landscape to ground the impossible in the mundane. The irony of Julian's life, a life dedicated to the precision of weight, the lightness of carbon fiber, the shedding of every unnecessary gram, was being reflected back by the heaviest object in the park. At 2:45 p.m., a team of psychologists and forensic profilers was brought in to analyze Julian's final journals, which had been recovered from his home in San Francisco. The handwriting in the final entries was no longer his. It was a series of mathematical proofs regarding the density of time. One entry, dated 2 days before his trip, simply read, "The climb doesn't end at the summit. It ends when the vertical becomes the horizontal." No signal, no trace, just silence. The expert was prepared for a ride, but he had been training for a departure. The narrative truth was beginning to emerge. Julian Vane had not disappeared. He had been translated. On November 9th at 4:30 p.m., the static-filled archival footage from a nearby weather station was reviewed one final time. In the background, barely visible through the digital noise, a figure can be seen moving toward the Royal Arches at a speed that exceeds any human capability. It isn't a blur of motion, it is a series of static frames, as if Julian were moving between the seconds of time itself. Flashbulb transitions in the footage reveal him appearing and disappearing, a ghost in the machine of the park's surveillance. He is wearing his cycling kit, he is still wearing the helmet, but he is no longer touching the ground. The grieving investigator watching this on a loop in a dark room realizes the moral warning of the story. We build our lives on the stability of the Earth, on the reliability of our gear, and on the permanence of our data. But the Earth is a shifting witness. At 5:19 p.m., the weather station's camera lens cracked from the inside out. The last image it captured was Julian's face pressed against the glass from the other side. His eyes were not eyes anymore. They were miniature versions of the geometric shadow, twin cubes of non-space that looked back with a somber, analytical reverence. He was no longer the victim. He was the chronicler. The mountains keep their secrets because the secrets are the only things that survive the passage of geological time. Why would he do this? The question echoes through the empty canyons. Perhaps because the summit he was seeking wasn't a place, but a state of being where the metadata of the soul finally aligns with the coordinates of the infinite. At 6 p.m., the National Park Service officially closed the investigation, citing a lack of actionable evidence. The impossible discovery had been buried under a mountain of redacted reports and non-disclosure agreements, but the experts know. They know that the heat in the helmet cam is the heat of a heart that refuses to stop beating in a dimension we cannot measure. They know that the silver blood in the obsidian screen is the price of the ultimate climb. Imagine you are sitting in your car at the park exit looking back at the peaks. You check your GPS. It says you are exactly where you should be. But for a split second, the screen flickers. The coordinates shift. You are no longer on the road. You are on the ledge. And for that second, you understand Julian Vane. You understand that the silence isn't an end, it's an invitation. The mountains don't explain why, but they are always listening. At 7:02 p.m., the first star appears over the valley, and for the first time in a month, the hum in the granite stops. The vacuum is filled with a peace so heavy it feels like a physical weight. The expert victim has found his rest, not in the dirt, but in the structure of the void itself. The reconstruction is complete, the narrative is closed, but the open loop of the mountain remains, waiting for the next person who believes they are prepared enough to see the truth. The final phase of the reconstruction began on November 12th, a day defined by a temperature inversion that trapped a thick, unnatural fog within the valley floor. It was the 2-month anniversary of the disappearance. At 8:19 a.m., a maintenance worker at the Ahwahnee Hotel discovered a final piece of evidence that would shatter the clinical distance of the official investigation. Resting on a stone pillar was a single cycling glove, right-handed, made of synthetic leather and carbon fiber padding. It was pristine. There was no weathering, no granite dust, and no sign of the 30-day snowstorm that had just passed. Inside the glove was a small rolled-up slip of thermal paper, a receipt from a park vending machine dated November 11th, 2024. The time on the receipt was 11:11 p.m. Julian Vane had been missing for 60 days, yet he had seemingly purchased a bottle of water 24 hours ago. The grieving investigator now faced the ultimate forensic paradox. The victim was operating within the timeline of the search while remaining physically absent from it. This was the iterative forensic reveal reaching its terminal point. The narrative truth was no longer about a man lost in the woods, but a man who had become a ghost in the park's administrative systems. At 9:30 a.m., the park's central server began to experience a massive data surge. Hundreds of gigabytes of metadata were being generated every second, all of them originating from a single source, Julian's deactivated satellite messenger. The pings were coming from inside the park headquarters. Imagine you are the technician watching the monitor as the dots appear on the digital map. They aren't random, they are drawing something. Over the course of 3 hours, the GPS pings traced a perfect three-dimensional rendering of Julian's own circulatory system across the topography of Yosemite. The valley was becoming his body. The granite was his bone. The rivers were his veins. The wind through the pines was his breath. At 12:45 p.m., the final ping dropped. It was located exactly 3 feet in front of the lead investigator's desk. There was nothing there but empty air and the smell of ozone. This is the rule of irony. Julian Vane spent his life trying to master his physical form through metrics and data, only to have his data become the only physical form he had left. At 2 p.m., the technical team attempted to shut down the server to stop the surge. They found that the code had rewritten itself into a non-linear language. It wasn't binary anymore. It was a series of symbols that resembled the crystalline structure of granite. The forensic casual language of the analysts failed them here. They could describe the how, the packet loss, the signal drift, the forensic imaging, but they could not touch the why. The mountains don't explain why, they only provide the hardware for a software we cannot comprehend. At 4:15 p.m., as the sun began to dip behind El Capitan, a final macro shot was captured by a motion-activated trail camera near the Royal Arches. The image is blurry, filled with the static of a high EMF environment. It shows a bicycle, Julian's bicycle, moving down the service road at 60 miles per hour. There is no rider. The pedals are spinning with a cadence of 120 revolutions per minute. The chain is a blur of silver. The bike is leaning into the turns as if steered by a master, navigating the treacherous curves with a precision that defies centrifugal force. It passes the camera and vanishes into a flashbulb transition of pure white light. At 5 p.m., the bike was found once again, leaning against the same tree where it had been discovered weeks prior. This time, the odometer showed an additional 400 miles. The tires were hot to the touch. The water bottles were empty, but the interior of the plastic was coated with a thin layer of frost, despite the 50-degree temperature. The investigator reached into the saddlebag and pulled out a final log. It was a digital voice recorder. He pressed play. The audio was not a voice. It was the sound of a heart beating, slow and steady, interspersed with the sound of a bicycle freewheel clicking, a rhythmic mechanical ticking that sounded like a clock counting down to zero. At 6:30 p.m., the sun vanished completely, and the park was plunged into a silence so absolute it felt like a physical sensory deprivation chamber. The moral warning of Julian Vane's story is not about the dangers of the wilderness, but the danger of the open loop. We believe that if we measure everything, if we track every heartbeat and every GPS coordinate, we can eliminate the unknown. But the unknown is not a lack of data. The unknown is the destination that the data is leading us toward. Julian was the perfect specimen of the modern age, a man of science, of gear, of preparation. And the mountains took that preparation and used it to build a bridge to a place where he no longer needed it. Imagine you are standing on the summit of Glacier Point, looking down at the lights of the valley. You feel the weight of your phone in your pocket, the tightness of your laces, the security of your map. And then you hear it, the low-frequency hum, the rhythmic clicking of a freewheel in the dark. You look at your hands and for a split second you see the bone beneath the skin. Do you run back to the car, back to the world of labels and logic? Or do you follow the GPS drift into the trees? The mountains keep their secrets because we are not yet quiet enough to hear them. Julian Vane became the silence. He is the static on the archival footage, the heat in the dead battery, the 1.6 centimeters of scorched earth that grows when no one is looking. The case is closed, the files are archived, and the expert victim has been erased from the registries of the living. But at 9:15 a.m. every morning, the sensors at the Bridal Veil Fall turnoff still record a momentary spike in heart rate, 188 beats per minute, lasting for exactly 3 minutes. A ghost in the machinery of the world. No signal, no trace, just the mountain waiting for the next expert to arrive. The vertical has become the horizontal. The climb is over. The secret is kept.